It's the night of April 25, 1978, in Kansas City, Missouri, and inside a small home, four people are about to become the victims of a shooting that will eventually put an innocent 18-year-old behind bars for the next 43 years of his life. Four men break into the house. Shots are fired. By the time it's over, three people are dead, and a fourth, a young woman named Cynthia Douglas, is left severely injured but alive, the only survivor and the only witness capable of telling police exactly who had been in that room. 18-year-old Kevin Strickland was nowhere near that house that night. He was home, watching television, exactly the kind of unremarkable evening that should never have connected him to a triple murder in any way. And yet within days, his name enters the investigation, based not on physical evidence, not on any connection to the crime scene, but on a chain of second-hand suggestion that begins, remarkably, with someone who wasn't even present that night. Kevin Strickland will spend the next 43 years in prison for a crime multiple people, including witnesses at the actual scene, said from the very beginning that he had nothing to do with. This is the story of how the American justice system convicted an innocent man twice, ignored a recantation for decades, and still made him fight, year after year, simply to be believed. Before we get into this one, tell me where you're watching from tonight. Drop your city in the comments and let me know what time it is where you are right now. I read every single one of these. If the idea that a man could serve 43 years in prison, the longest wrongful conviction in an entire state's history, while the actual evidence pointed away from him from the very first days, disturbs you as much as it disturbed me while researching this case, hit subscribe right now. Because what happened to Kevin Strickland is going to make you angry in a way few cases on this channel have. To understand how deeply wrong this case went, you have to understand who Kevin Strickland actually was before April of 1978. He was 18 years old, living in Kansas City, an ordinary young black man with no meaningful connection to the four victims of that night's shooting, no documented history that would place him anywhere near that house, and no physical evidence, at any point in this entire case, that would ever tie him to the scene of the crime. His account of that night never wavered across more than 4 decades. He was home. He was watching television. He had nothing to do with what happened. This matters enormously because it's the foundation this entire case sits on top of. Unlike so many wrongful conviction cases that involve at least some tangential connection between the accused and the crime, some relationship, some prior interaction, some plausible reason investigators initially looked in that direction, Kevin Strickland's case involves almost none of that. He became a suspect through a process that, once you understand exactly how it unfolded, is genuinely difficult to reconcile with any reasonable standard of criminal investigation. On the night of April 25, 1978, 4 men broke into a Kansas City home and opened fire on the people inside. 3 victims died. A fourth, Cynthia Douglas, survived despite being struck by a shotgun blast, making her the only living witness capable of identifying who had actually been in that room. In the chaotic, urgent hours and days following a crime this violent, investigators needed answers quickly, and the pressure to identify suspects fast can create exactly the kind of conditions where careful, methodical investigation gives way to something far less reliable. Here is where this case takes its first genuinely alarming turn. Cynthia Douglas' sister, a woman who was not present at the crime scene, who did not witness the shooting, who had no first-hand knowledge of who had actually been in that house that night, suggested to investigators that Kevin Strickland could have been one of the perpetrators. This wasn't an eyewitness identification. This wasn't physical evidence. This was a second-hand suggestion from someone with no direct knowledge of the event, based, as best as can be reconstructed from the historical record, on nothing more than a general description that Strickland happened to loosely fit. Once that name entered the investigation, Cynthia Douglas herself was shown Strickland, and she identified him as one of the men involved. This single identification, made by a survivor still recovering from a gunshot wound, in the immediate aftermath of one of the most traumatic experiences a person can survive, became the entire foundation of the case against Kevin Strickland. Not corroborating physical evidence, not fingerprints, not any connection between Strickland and the other men eventually convicted alongside him. One identification, seeded initially by someone who wasn't even there. When Kevin Strickland's case first went to trial, something happened that, in hindsight, should have been a serious warning sign about how thin the actual case against him truly was. The jury deadlocked. 11 jurors were prepared to convict. One juror held out, refusing to vote guilty, unconvinced that the evidence presented actually proved Strickland's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That lone holdout was the only black juror on the panel. Sit with that detail for a moment, because it's not a minor footnote in this story. It's close to the entire story in miniature. 11 jurors, drawn from a jury pool and a broader community context that would go on to produce, in Strickland's second trial, an all-white jury entirely, were prepared to convict an 18-year-old black man based on a single eyewitness identification with no corroborating physical evidence whatsoever. The one juror who wasn't prepared to do that, the one person in that room who apparently looked at this evidence with a different level of scrutiny, was the only black person deciding Strickland's fate. This isn't a case where we're speculating about invisible bias shaping an outcome from a distance. We're looking at a documented, specific moment where an actual jury's votes broke down in exactly the pattern that decades of research into wrongful convictions has shown, again and again, tends to disadvantage black defendants specifically, and where the sole juror willing to seriously question the prosecution's case happened to be the sole juror who shared Strickland's own background, and perhaps a more grounded understanding of exactly how unreliable a single eyewitness identification, made under traumatic circumstances, can actually be. I want to know what you're thinking at this point in the story. Drop a comment below. Does it surprise you that the only holdout juror in that first trial was the only black person on the panel? I'm genuinely curious how many of you have heard about the documented racial patterns in wrongful conviction cases before watching this. Because the first trial ended without a verdict, prosecutors retried Kevin Strickland. This time, the jury was entirely white, and this time presented with essentially the same case, the same single eyewitness identification, the same complete absence of physical evidence connecting Strickland to the crime scene. That jury convicted him. He was found guilty of 1 count of capital murder and 2 counts of second-degree murder. Prosecutors withdrew the death penalty from his case after conviction, which meant Kevin Strickland, 18 years old at the time of his arrest, was instead sentenced to life in prison, a sentence that would ultimately keep him incarcerated for the next 43 years. It's worth pausing here to fully absorb what that means. If Strickland had been sentenced to death rather than life in prison, and if his exoneration had come as slowly as it actually did, more than 4 decades later, he would very likely have already been executed for a crime he did not commit, long before anyone with the power to correct that error ever got the chance to do so. That's not a hypothetical detail included for dramatic effect. It's a genuine, documented possibility that sits at the center of why this case matters so much to conversations about the death penalty specifically, because wrongful convictions don't announce themselves as wrongful at the moment of sentencing. They look, to the people handing down that sentence, exactly like justice being served. 2 other men were also convicted in connection with the murders that night, Vincent Bell and Kiln Adkins. And here is where this case becomes almost impossible to fully reconcile with any reasonable understanding of how the justice system is supposed to function. Both Bell and Adkins, the men actually connected to and convicted of participating in this crime, said from early on that Kevin Strickland was not involved. Not years later, under the pressure of a media campaign or an Innocence organization's advocacy. From early on, close to the actual events themselves, the two men who were genuinely there told anyone who would listen that Strickland had nothing to do with it. Beyond their statements, there was physical evidence available that should have raised serious questions about Strickland's guilt from the very beginning. Fingerprints recovered from the shotgun used in the attack did not match Kevin Strickland's fingerprints. This is worth repeating plainly, because it's easy to let a detail like this slide past without fully registering its significance. The physical evidence collected directly from the murder weapon itself excluded Kevin Strickland as the person who had held that gun. And still, his conviction stood, for decades, built entirely around one traumatized survivor's initial identification, an identification that had itself originated from a suggestion made by someone who wasn't even present at the scene. This is the part of Kevin Strickland's case that I think is genuinely the hardest to sit with. This wasn't a situation where the truth simply wasn't available, where investigators did their best with limited information and still got it wrong through no fault of anyone's careful effort. The truth was sitting right there. The two men who actually committed this crime were saying from early on that Strickland wasn't involved. The physical evidence from the murder weapon excluded him. And none of it was enough to overturn a conviction built on a single, second-hand seated eyewitness identification. Stay with me here, because what happens over the following decades is the reason this case eventually became recognized as one of the longest wrongful convictions in American history. And it's worth staying for exactly how long it actually took for any of this to matter to the system that had convicted him. Years into Kevin Strickland's imprisonment, Cynthia Douglas, the survivor whose identification had anchored the entire case against him, recanted her testimony. She said she had been pressured by police to falsely implicate Strickland. This is an extraordinary admission, coming directly from the one person whose account had provided the entire evidentiary foundation for his conviction, and it should have been enough on its own to trigger an immediate and thorough re-examination of the case. It wasn't. Cynthia Douglas' recantation sat largely unaddressed by the legal system for years. She would eventually pass away in 2015, having spent the final years of her own life trying, without success, to help undo a conviction she herself had come to recognize was built on testimony she never should have given in the first place. Kevin Strickland remained in prison throughout this entire period, watching the one piece of testimony that had defined the rest of his life get formally disavowed by the very person who gave it, while the legal system that had relied on that testimony continued to hold him regardless. There is a specific, compounding cruelty in this part of the story that deserves to be named directly. It's one thing for a wrongful conviction to persist, because the truth simply hadn't yet come to light. It's an entirely different kind of injustice for a wrongful conviction to persist for years after the central witness has explicitly recanted, after the two men actually involved in the crime have said the same thing, after physical evidence has excluded the convicted man from the murder weapon itself. At that point, the ongoing incarceration isn't really about uncertainty anymore. It's about institutional inertia, a system that finds it far easier to leave a conviction standing than to formally admit it made a catastrophic, decades-long mistake. Eventually, Kevin Strickland's case came to the attention of the Midwest Innocence Project, based at the University of Missouri-Kansas City School of Law, an organization dedicated specifically to advocating on behalf of people who have been wrongfully convicted. Working alongside Strickland and building on the recantation, the exonerating statements from Bell and Adkins, and the fingerprint evidence that had never matched him, the organization began the long process of pushing his case back into the legal system for genuine reconsideration. A significant turning point came when the Jackson County Prosecutor's Office established a conviction review unit, specifically tasked with investigating claims of wrongful conviction within cases the office itself had originally prosecuted. After reviewing Strickland's case in full, the unit reached an extraordinary conclusion. Kevin Strickland was innocent. He became the first person exonerated through that specific conviction review unit's work, a case Jackson County prosecutor Gene Peters Baker would later describe as bringing justice, finally, to a man who had suffered so greatly as a result of a wrongful conviction. Even with the local prosecutor's office now formally agreeing that Strickland had been wrongfully convicted, his path to actual freedom was still not straightforward. Missouri's Attorney General at the time, Eric Schmidt, actively opposed Strickland's exoneration, defending the original conviction rather than supporting the effort to correct it. Missouri's governor declined Strickland's requests for clemency. Even with overwhelming evidence, even with the local prosecutor who had originally secured this conviction now actively working to undo it, political resistance from other corners of Missouri's legal and political establishment continued to slow down what should have been, at that point, an uncomplicated correction of an obvious injustice. This raises an uncomfortable question worth sitting with. When multiple layers of the justice system, a local prosecutor's own review unit, the actual perpetrators of the crime, a recanting witness and physical evidence itself, all point toward the same conclusion, why does political resistance from other officials still have the power to delay that correction for additional months, even years? Kevin Strickland's freedom, at this point in the story, wasn't really being debated on the merits of the evidence anymore. It was being contested as a matter of political positioning, with an actual innocent man's continued incarceration serving as the stakes of that contest. In November of 2021, after a 3-day evidentiary hearing, Missouri Judge James Welsh finally ordered Kevin Strickland's immediate release. The judge's ruling was direct and unambiguous, finding that the court's confidence in Strickland's conviction had been so thoroughly undermined that the judgment could not stand. Kevin Strickland, now 62 years old, walked out of Western Missouri Correctional Center in Cameron, Missouri. A free man, 43 years after he had first been arrested for a crime he had always maintained he had nothing to do with. Try to sit with what 43 years actually represents in the span of an entire human life. Kevin Strickland entered prison at 18 years old and walked out at 62. He missed the entirety of what should have been his adult life, every ordinary milestone, every relationship that might have formed and grown across 4 decades, every career he might have built, all of it simply gone, replaced instead by more than 4 decades spent inside a prison system for a crime the actual evidence, examined honestly, never actually supported. His case is recognized, according to the National Registry of Exonerations, as the longest wrongful imprisonment in Missouri's history, and among the longest documented in the United States overall. Only a small handful of other cases nationwide have ever involved an exoneration coming more than 42 years after an original wrongful conviction. Kevin Strickland's 43 years places him among an almost unimaginably small group of people who have survived an injustice of this exact magnitude and lived long enough to see it finally corrected. And here is a detail that captures something genuinely infuriating about how the American legal system handles compensation for wrongful convictions. Despite losing 43 years of his life to a conviction the state itself now acknowledged was wrong, Kevin Strickland was not entitled to any compensation from Missouri, because Missouri's compensation law applies only to exoneration secured specifically through DNA evidence. Strickland's case involved no DNA evidence at all, no biological material connecting or excluding him from the crime scene. His exoneration came instead through recanted testimony, exonerating statements from the actual perpetrators, and non-matching fingerprint evidence, forms of proof the state of Missouri simply doesn't recognize as sufficient grounds for compensating someone for 4 decades of wrongful imprisonment. Think about the message embedded in a law structured that way. A state can hold an innocent man in prison for 43 years, can eventually acknowledge, through its own prosecutor's office, that this man was wrongfully convicted, and can still, under its own compensation statute, owe him nothing, simply because the specific mechanism that proved his innocence happened to be recanted testimony and physical evidence rather than DNA. It's a gap in the law that Kevin Strickland's case, more than almost any other in recent memory, has helped expose to a much wider public audience. In the absence of any state compensation, something remarkable happened in the wake of Strickland's release. Members of the public, moved by the scale of the injustice he had survived, began donating directly to support him. Within days of his release, public donations had surpassed $1 million, an outpouring of support that, while it can never truly compensate for 43 years of stolen life, at least offered Kevin Strickland something the state of Missouri's own laws had refused to provide. There is a broader lesson sitting underneath every part of Kevin Strickland's story, and it's worth nomming directly as we bring this case to a close. This wasn't a case built on some sophisticated, hard-to-detect forensic error. It wasn't a case where new scientific techniques eventually revealed a truth that simply wasn't accessible at the time of the original trial. This was a case where the truth was available almost from the very beginning. A survivor's identification originating from someone who wasn't present, the actual perpetrators saying, early and repeatedly, that Strickland wasn't involved, physical evidence from the murder weapon excluding him, a hung jury, with the lone dissenting voice belonging to the only black juror in the room. None of it was hidden. All of it was simply not enough for 43 years to outweigh the momentum of a conviction that had already been secured. Kevin Strickland's case has become a genuine touchstone in conversations about wrongful conviction, about the reliability of eyewitness identification, about the racial dynamics that continue to shape jury outcomes in this country, and about the arbitrary, often illogical gaps in how states decide who deserves compensation for the years the justice system has taken from them. It's a case that resists any comfortable narrative about the system eventually, inevitably correcting its own mistakes. The system didn't correct itself here through some inherent capacity for self-reflection. It was pushed, relentlessly, by a legal advocacy organization, by a local prosecutor's office willing to admit its own institution's failure, and ultimately by a judge willing to say plainly that a conviction this thoroughly undermined simply could not stand. All of it happening only after 43 years had already been taken from a man who had said, from the very first day, that he was innocent. One more before we wrap this one up. What's the weather like where you are right now? Let me know down in the comments. I like knowing who's out there watching, wherever you happen to be tonight. If this case affected you the way it affected me while researching it, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. I've got another true crime story going up soon that I think you're going to want to be here for. And if you made it all the way to the end of this video, drop a comment and let me know what stayed with you most about this one. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.